start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people, and pay our respect to the elders past and present and emerging. And I'd also like to recognise and acknowledge as a British citizen the role that we have played and continue to play in colonialism. And I pray that one day there will be true reparations. In order to ensure all our voices are heard, the way to interact with today's session is through the app. And if you're here in person, and via the virtual platform for those watching at home. The chat function can be found under the Ideas tab, and you can also submit questions which can be upvoted. You can vote for your favourite question to make sure they reach the presenters. That's us. I hope we'll have time for questions. We've got an awful lot to cover today. We're literally having a global tour of conversion therapy and practices around the world. And I come from Britain, you might hear, and I chair the UK Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition in the UK. I've also worked with conversion people fighting conversion therapy and looking for bans in countries across the world. And I'm glad we're going to be able to hear from some of them today. Conversion therapy is a hidden curse, which I'm glad that so many nations are now beginning to recognize the harm that it has done and continues to do. It's an umbrella term that can mean a range of practices in therapeutic settings, primarily often in religious settings, in cultural settings, and affects lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual people. Various studies have now been done. In the UK, we've done a study amongst LGBT folk, and that showed that nearly 72% of them went through it because they believed who they are is sinful, or that they were ashamed of their desires. And we know that the outcomes are horrific. The level of attempted suicide, of self-harm, and even, sadly, of even actual suicide. And today we will be, sadly, touching on various really painful matters. And if you are triggered by any of that, I would urge you to seek some of the help that's available here in the conference. Do exercise self-care. It's a difficult topic. It may well resonate with some of your own experiences. Recently, the Global Interfaith Commission on LGBT Lives, which I myself chaired, commissioned some research in Hungary, and we'll be hearing from Manny a little later on, and in the Caribbean. And we had an independent board of experts who oversaw that research. The chair was Professor Zoe Playden, and she, I think, captured some of the horror of what we face by saying in her preface to the report, and you can get copies if you want to from me afterwards, but she said this, that it affects primarily children at a key part and stage of their lives. They are defenseless and at a critical stage of their adolescent development, and they turn to help to those they trusted in what should have been places of safety, their church, their doctor's surgery, their home, and found there only prejudice and harm. Their abusers are emboldened by a toxic culture whose constant negative message is that it is not acceptable for LGBT people to be who they intrinsically are. And we're going to hear some of the stories and some of the work, some of the research, some of the actions, and some of the good news stories from around the world. We're going to take about half an hour to do that. We're going to have a brief conversation with some of the themes that are coming out with our panelists, and then I hope we'll have some time for questions, and we'll have you finished by 1 o'clock for the next panel. We're going to open by hearing from Yvonne Wamari, who's the Africa Programme Officer at Outright International. She can't sadly be with us, and so she sent us a video. She's been doing the most incredible work across the African region, looking particularly at conversion practices. She's been doing some research in Kenya, South Africa, and other countries. And I know that she has so much more than she can actually say in this video. So do please go to the Outright International website and learn more of what they're doing. But perhaps we can hear from her now.
I'm Owino-Wamari, joining you from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm the Africa Program Officer at Interfaith International, a global organization that works with partners around the globe to strengthen the capacity of LGBTQ movements. We document and amplify human rights violations and advocate for inclusion and equality. Interfaith has been carrying out a number of initiatives to condemn and challenge conversion practices globally. Interfaith, in its report, Harmful Treatment, the global research on so-called conversion therapy, found that these harmful practices take place everywhere and range in their levels of physical and psychological abuse. The global research on so-called conversion therapy also found that although conversion practices has been documented very well, actually, in Western countries, no in-depth study had been undertaken to characterize the nature and extent of these damaging and degrading practices in any African country. So in 2019, Interfaith, working with local partners, GULC in Kenya, Access Chapter 2 in South Africa, and the Initiative for Equal Rights in Nigeria, embarked on a project to build a body of knowledge on conversion practices in these countries to inform advocacy towards eradicating these harmful practices in all their forms in Africa. The 3 research reports fill the knowledge gap by providing substantial data on conversion practices in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, and contribute to much needed evidence of harm and have been informing advocacy interventions to curtail these harmful practices since then. I can briefly share with you some of the cross-cutting findings of the data collected in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. A total of 2,891 LGBTQ respondents from the 3 countries were surveyed, and more than half of the respondents indicated that they had undergone some form of conversion practice. The cross-cutting forms identified in the research include talk therapy, exorcisms, drinking of herbs, prayer, laying of hands for healing, beatings, and rape, or other forms of sexual assault. Frequently, several forms of conversion practices were combined in an effort to change the identity or sexual orientation of a person, either simultaneously or over periods of time. And as a result, most of the respondents surveyed indicated that they endured more than one form of conversion practice. The practices against LGBTIQ individuals increase in intensity from the moment of discovery, starting usually with family talks and conversations, and escalating to counseling or prayer, and then to violence, economic distress, and ostracization when other methods do not work. Conversion practices are often perpetrated over long periods of time, and with the aim that change will occur, and usually it never did occur. And what we found within our research is that the victims would have to pretend to have changed so that they could escape these violent and harmful treatments being meted upon them. So now, as we celebrate World Pride, may our voices be loud in condemning homophobia and transphobia, and may our hearts go out in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in restricted spaces, and may our actions continue to shatter structural barriers meant to oppress us. Happy Pride to everybody. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. Grateful thanks to Yvonne, and do look up her work on the Outright International website. Now, our next speaker is one of my LGBT heroes. Yanhui Peng is a survivor of conversion practices from China, the director of LGBT rights advocacy in China. And he's going to tell you a little bit of what he went through and how he took on the place where he went through, the clinic, in a litigation, and won, and has bravely stood up against the Chinese state for the rights of LGBT people. So please give him a very warm welcome. Yanhui, thank you.
Thanks, Jayne. Can you hear me? Yes. And thanks World Pride for inviting me to the Human Rights Conference to share our stories. I'm Jens. I'm from China, and I will tell you the story about what we are doing. So 10 years ago, around 2012 or 2013, there are a lot of community members in China, they suffering conversion therapy in hospital and clinic. They share their story on social media. And we started to take action to stop conversion therapy in China. And we try to campaign to the government body, the health department and commercial department to stop conversion therapy. But the government body do nothing about this, and some of the clinic and hospitals started to advertise themselves on Chinese Google, like Baidu, the search engine, the largest search engine. So you search the keywords about like gay cure, conversion therapy, or gay, or LGBT. The first result, like showing on the top, is their advertisement, telling that they provide professional conversion therapy. Even some of them talk on the media that they provide electric shock conversion therapy. So because there are a typical story from a lesbian couple who live in the northeast of China. After they found out by their parents, they was enforced to accept the conversion treatment in a hospital. So the community organization don't know how to deal with that problem to stop conversion therapy. And then we would like to try how to use the legal process to stop this kind of treatment in China. But most of our community members, they're afraid to come out. They don't believe, or they don't have the hope that is it okay, is it possible the Chinese legal system can support our rights. But I just cannot wait. So in 2014, I decided to go to one of the clinic to experience one's electric shock conversion therapy. So after the experience, I was hypnosis and electric shock by that clinic. And then I run away and take them to the court in Beijing. We don't have evidence that the court system in China can accept our case. But luckily, we go to the court. I remember in 2014, July the 24th, a lot of our community members, they protest, they raise their rainbow flag in front of court. That's the first time the Chinese community, LGBT community, used the litigation to advocate for their rights. I also bring a little rainbow flag to the court to give me more energy. I think it's because of this energy from the community. Luckily, we won the case in 2014.
Well done.
And the verdict from the court stating homosexuality is not a disease. It was the first time the Chinese official document stating this it's not a disease anymore. And also the verdict also said promising gay cure is illegal advertisement. So we are so, happy and glad and surprised for the result. And then we spread the information on the media, including national television and the mainstream newspaper all talk about our case with a positive way and telling the public that gay cure bring a lot of harm and homosexuality is not a disease. So we try to use the case to advocate in our media, talk to the general public, including our parents. My parents also saw me on the TV first time I come out to them.
Gosh.
So, but this verdict, because our parents' generation, they need official document to tell them the result. So we spread it to people who organizing the parents to support the community member. However, like even we won the case, the policy haven't changed. So in 2016, also a 36 years old gay man who lived in a small village in China, he experienced 19 days in hospital accepting the conversion therapy. The hospital said because of their parents agree, they live in the hospital. Even he has 36 years old. There are many our community members still experience conversion therapy, especially trans teenagers. So there are many trans girls. They were taken by their parents not only to the hospital but also to like different training schools, like accept the physical training, like masculinity training, something like that. So we organize many lawyers to provide pro bono to our community. So conversion therapy in China, they use different ways, including pills, hypnosis, electroshock, and all kinds of treatment. So we try to work on it. During the past 10 years, we provide legal support and also organize training to the psychologic and psychiatric professionals, and also would like to empower our community to say no. So now more and more community members who experience conversion therapy, they dare to say no to their parents and to the professionals. So we hope we can continue our work under international support. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yanhui. Well done. Thank you. A true hero. And if you can, do come alongside and speak to Yanhui. There's so much that's going on in China that needs your support. And knowing that there is a full family, a global family supporting him is really key. So please do talk to him. Our next speaker, Mariann Filo, is someone I know well because she's undertook research for us, the Global Interfaith Commission in Hungary on conversion practices. She herself is a psychologist and an LGBTQ activist, and she's also a member of the Budapest Pride security team and planning team. And if those of you who know how tough things are in Hungary at the moment will know the courage that she has and her colleagues to stand up and just be seen. So you've done a lot of research, Manny, on various things, including the far right and religious extremism. And I know you're going to share a little bit about conversion practices in Hungary now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here at Sydney World Pride. As you heard, I'm a psychologist and also an activist, and I'm from Hungary, which is a Central European country, but it doesn't seem like that. Our government passed so many anti-LGBT laws that I couldn't list them all because the time is short. And to make it short, our Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, uses the Polish and Russian narratives and anti-LGBT laws to pass laws in Hungary as well. Our government also make organizing Pride Festival and the Pride March difficult, and while our country gave home to several pro-conversion therapy conferences. And in this region, we conducted the research last year, and we conducted an online survey. 538 participants filled it out, and from those number of people, 54 people experienced some kind of conversion therapy practices. And we also did 5 in-depth interviews, and we found that the people who offered conversion therapy to those survivors are authority figures like psychiatrists or psychologists, religious leaders or parents, telling that it is a mental illness or a sin. We found that people were forced or cursed to do conversion therapy, or those who went under conversion therapy voluntarily also were subjected to high levels of coercion. The motivation was the feeling of shame, fear and pressure, and these practices were conducted by medical professionals and psychiatrists as well, also religious leaders. These practices lasted for some years in general and started at a critical time of the emotional development and identity formation during childhood. And the two main forms were psychotherapeutic and religious practices. And in Hungary, there isn't really an official discussion about conversion therapy, neither on a political level, neither in a level of the psychology science. And we are very far away from banning conversion therapy, but I think our research was a great way to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Well done. So again, do talk to Manny about the research. It's very difficult to even lift the lid on it and to know that it's going on primarily in therapeutic settings and indeed even in religious settings, even though Hungary doesn't have that large of a religious community. Our next speaker, Andre Afamasaga, have I pronounced that right? Yes, is Samoan. Thank you, forgive me, I'm learning. And you advocate for rainbow inclusion in family, religious and cultural settings. Andre was a pastor for 11 years before very bravely and publicly coming out in the Sydney Morning Herald. And he's a survivor, I think, of conversion practices himself. But at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, where you now you lead the conversion practices advisory, research and engagement teams, and you've been very key, I know, in working for civil redress responses to those who've been through conversion practices. And in many senses, you're giving us the hope of what a nation could do, and I know we're keen to hear some of what you've been up to. Thank you, Andre.
Awesome. Well, talofa lava, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings. I wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we meet. I wish to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. And I wish to acknowledge brother boys and sister girls. I stand in deep solidarity and respect and love for your struggle. Also want to acknowledge the convener and fellow conversion practices survivors here. Thanks for what you do around the world. And by way of show of hands, if you feel comfortable, if you have experienced conversion practices yourself, would you be so brave to raise your hand today, if that's okay? Well, I wish for the rest of us around then to give you a hand as well, to acknowledge your leadership, your expertise in this area. I'm here in two capacities. Number one, personally, I was a survivor of conversion practices here in New South Wales, actually, so I'm really excited to hear that a potential ban is on the way. I experienced those for 15 years as well. I'm also here in a professional capacity as well, because I used to be a church pastor. And in fact, I'm so tempted in front of the mic to say something cheesy like turn to the person next to you and say blah, blah, blah. However, I was a pastor in Campbelltown, just down the road, Macfields 2564 represent. And I was really proud to be part of that community, but all the while I was really struggling with my sexuality. And until age 41, and I don't look that old, I had to make the decision to leave a vocation that I really, really dearly loved behind in order for me to accept my sexuality. But it's the best thing I ever did. But I'm also here professionally, as Jayne has referred, as Senior Manager at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and under the new Conversion Practices Prohibition Legislation Act, which just passed over a year ago. Awesome. We have a legislative mandate function, and that's to facilitate what we call the Civil Redress Scheme. I want to acknowledge the Chief Human Rights Commissioner, Paul Hunt, who oversees SOGIESC portfolio, as well as my colleague Jayne Polkinghorn, who some of you know, who's our SOGIESC advisor, and also my colleague V. Blackwood in the room today. The people here on the screen is that the ban for conversion practices in New Zealand came again from the community, from activists, from parliamentarians, and New Zealanders have sent the overwhelming message that conversion practices are harmful and they do not belong here. It was responsible, it broke records, it was unprecedented in terms of having the highest number of petitions before Parliament, and in the Select Committee, it attracted more submissions than anyone else. So some of the people here on the screen are behind that. So I acknowledge you all. Some of those people are not here with us anymore as well. So this is a really important fight. You can read about the legislation yourself in terms of what we do. It was really based largely on the Victorian Conversion Suppression Act, which is amazing. So if you worked on that, again, sorry, I'm such a pastor, but can we give them a hand? Because that was a really amazing work. I acknowledge the work of Nathan and many others, as well as those in Victoria who administered this bill as well. The Civil Redress Scheme. So you can read about that, but basically what this has done in New Zealand is it's created two criminal offences as well as civil wrongs as well. So it means that people can come to the Human Rights Commission if they've experienced conversion practices, and they can access our mediation and our inquiry services as well. But there's a number of things that the Human Rights Commission cannot do. We cannot do investigations. We don't have those powers under this. We cannot make determinations, but what we can do is provide some education training, and also what this legislation does is send a really strong signal and the moral assurance to survivors that these practices are not welcome here. So I want to just really concentrate on the last part of my talk is now that those of us who have set up this, now that the legislation is live, and now that we administered the service, what have we done that perhaps people in other places can learn from? Number one, I think that one of the things that we've done, which I'm really proud of, is that our service is survivor-led and survivor-centred. On the bottom of this page, you will see some of my colleagues here. We've been lucky we got government funding, but we've got the number of, there's a combination of contractors and part-time, short-time people, part-time people, but currently I think 4 of our 5 members are survivors of conversion practices themselves, so I want to acknowledge them. It's really important if you're setting up a service that is survivor-led and survivor-centred, in other words, so we don't cause unintended consequences and harm. Survivors have told us that they want a nuanced response when it comes to running a civil redress. That means the language needs to be nuanced. And I do get concerned when we start to talk about conversion practices that are archaic. It's so easy for the opponents of conversion practices to say that they don't practice those as well. So it has to be nuanced, it has to be really survivor-centred and led. It means that when we're engaging with conversion practices survivors, that we give them koha and we pay them for their time as well. It means that when we engage them, we actually provide EAP counselling sessions for up to 3 sessions for free and more if they need, because we understand what they contribute to us, that is a gift to us rather than what we should expect from them as well. And it's really important that we understand that it's the choice for conversion practices as well, that we offer them a number of choices. So for instance, some conversion practices survivors have said to us that actually they want to go into mediation, or some of them don't want to go into mediation to face the people that harmed them, and some of them actually don't want a criminal offence to be brought against the people that have harmed them. Rather, they just want them to know that what they've done is wrong and to stop it, because some of these people they have relationships with as well. Secondly, we're really proud of our approaches towards the Indigenous Tangata Whenua Māori people of New Zealand, and Pacific and ethnic communities as well. So I need to say this because we're a part of the state apparatus, and so we're part of a government colonial system that is entrenched in white supremacy, ableism, and heteronormativity. And so that means that when we set up a service, it's not enough just to say, come to us, because we know that some of these communities have deep distrust based on years and centuries and sometimes legislative discrimination against them. So what can we do to close that gap so that they can get to us and we can go to them? How can we have services that are responsive, that aren't centred around government bureaucracy, but rather how can we have it so that we can facilitate access to justice for them? And that means as well that as part of us in the public service, it's contingent actually in our legislation that we need to learn Indigenous, Te Ao Māori forms of even gender and sexuality as well. So that's really great for us. It actually lifts the bar for us in the public service, and we take that really, really seriously. The last thing that I think we need to do as well, which we have to do, is because with the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, is that we need to balance all rights as well. And that means we need to demonstrate mature discourse, human rights discourse, including those that we disagree with as well. On one hand, we provide an impartial, independent advocacy, complaint service where we need to be seen to be trustworthy for everyone. On the other hand, we also provide advocacy as well. So for us in this age of mis and disinformation, and a media that is driven by the algorithm and headlines that are very unhelpful to many of our causes, how do we elevate the conversation and have a human rights discourse that is less about this person against that person, but rather how do we balance human rights? And so for us, it means that we are independent, but we also do flex the mana, and that means the power and the status of who the New Zealand Human Rights Commission is to advocate for people with human rights. So we need to hold those up in balance. The last thing, which I'll probably get to later, is that we need to do education and prevention as well, and that is with key settings such as religious and cultural settings. It is not enough to have the law, we need to express the intent of the law, and that means that we need to have, as it says over here, how do we have a nuanced whānau conversation? And whānau conversation means a family-centred conversation. It means that survivors of conversion practices and rainbow people don't exist in isolation. They come from families as well, and sometimes it's actually their families that are causing them the greatest harm. Sometimes it's their religious communities that are causing them the greatest harm. How do we make the changes that are really important while at the same time giving that person the agency to access that as a place of well-being if they choose, but to stop the practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andre. Now, last but no means least, Nathan Despott is, I would say, the global lead on creating a model, and we have a lot to thank Nathan for. He himself is a survivor of 10 years of conversion practices and has worked with other survivors and to ensure a survivor-led approach to the Victorian legislation, which is being used as a go-to gold standard by many governments and civil rights groups around the world. Nathan, you're on the steering committee, I think, of the Brave Network, which works to support and be an advocacy group for survivors. And I know we've all got a huge amount to thank you for. You're working with La Trobe University now to research Australian conversion ideology and practices. And I'm sorry we've only got 5 minutes or so, but we do look Nathan up if you haven't done so already, because there is a wealth of expertise and knowledge, and we're going to get some of it now. Thank you. No, a minute.
I'm going to read because I'm terrible at doing it off the top of my head or remembering things. The two groups I'm part of, Sojai Survivors and Brave Network, spent several years working to support survivors in my home state of Victoria on mostly Wurundjeri and Bunurong country of the Kulin Nation, and including supporting survivors on how to share their stories to media, how to say no to media, how to tell media, well, instead of asking me, a gay white male, here's this trans person of colour you might want to speak to instead. If you don't like it, bad luck, they get a voice too. Also training media on how to engage respectfully and in a trauma-informed way with survivors. How to articulate a definition of conversion practices that made sure that the focus in media and government was on a broad range of contexts, not just white, gay, cis men from Christian backgrounds like me. We wrote a manifesto called the Sojai Survivor Statement and were eventually invited by government to crunch the issues together. Years of research was undertaken using participatory methods, and the structure of the civil response scheme that is now part of the world's strongest conversion law was designed by survivors with support from queer health organisation Thorn Harbour Health and public servants on whiteboards and in joint video meetings with tears and biscuits and coffee and rants and screaming at each other and then hugging each other. This model focuses on non-violent communication and put community education, investigation and survivor support referrals into the law. I want to acknowledge folks like Chris Chabbs, who can't be here today because he's laid on his back with COVID, Commissioner Ro Allen, Dr. Tim Jones, who's here, Professor Tiffany Jones, Dr. Maria Pallotta Chiaroli, Percy Gertler, Abhinav Sard, and longtime advocate Anthony Van Brown, who you heard from yesterday. The battle to see this law passed in Victoria was utterly excruciating. The world's best model in Victoria has now been adopted in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with incredible expertise, to a limited extent in Canada, and is now being adapted for entry to Parliament in Scotland, Tasmania, and New South Wales. And this all seems very global, north and white. However, I've had the privilege to consult with many survivors, researchers, and advocates globally, and some global trends and framing are emerging. So I'll run through them three very quickly. In most cases, the problem is that the idea of queer people being broken or that queer people have a disorder, or in the case of trans people, are sometimes seen as not even existing, that this is the problem, and this problem is still existing today widely. Many people hold on to this idea and deliver or participate in activities based on this idea. The idea, which we call conversion ideology, is usually a combination of cultural or religious ideas mixed with pseudoscientific ideas in various proportions, depending on the context. Most proponents of conversion practices expend a great deal of energy trying to conceal these activities. They're inherently deceptive. Peppering kids with conversion ideology in religious schools, health practitioners delaying trans people's transitioning needlessly, dubious pastoral care referrals, people with intellectual disability in group homes being suppressed by their gatekeepers through collusion. Conversion practices can be disguised as prayer, manifest in suppression through shame and fear in families where one person being queer may have dire consequences for other siblings. These are all really common forms of conversion practices that we don't often hear about. The term conversion therapy is recognisable to many, however, most people who go through conversion practices have not experienced anything that even remotely resembles the word therapy. Coercion and consent are often used, but they're not really good terms because we really are more talking about internal coercion after years of internalising conversion ideology, or consent really through deception or misinformed consent. But the terms coercion and consent are often used by opponents to laws such as the law in Victoria because it makes things seem a little easier to reduce the definition of conversion practices and make it smaller. Using the term conversion practices rather than therapy has been really helpful in prompting people in the community to self-identify as survivors and seek informed help, which is the most important aspect. And my last point, before I finish this somehow mix of a TED Talk and an elevator pitch, is that while countries like Kenya, Lebanon, and Australia may seem like vastly different contexts, all have various forms of health regulation and provisions that relate to therapeutic fraud and similar contexts. Conversion ideology, whether in a religious or secular context, almost always contains pseudoscientific elements. And pseudoscience is very often seen as the domain of the state, particularly state-endorsed regulators. So articulating what conversion ideology looks like in each context is very important, particularly to tease apart the cultural elements from pseudoscience. It's very implausible for a Christian community to claim aspects of junk pseudoscience or early psychoanalytic psychotherapy from the 19th century as being part of 2,000-year-old tradition. In addition, conversion practices in health settings almost always contravene codes of ethics about competence, confidence, and informed consent. Pastoral workers who espouse conversion ideology often cross lines about false and misleading claims and duty of care in states where therapeutic fraud regulation exists. These are powerful levers that seem to exist in many more countries than you might realise. I last want to acknowledge a dear friend of mine, a friend of 25 years, who I'll call B, a gay Lebanese man from Melbourne who in his mid-40s took his life a few months ago. An untimely set of triggers unlocked his trauma, like a freight train hitting him from within. The harm inside of him wasn't any of the very sort of vague and nebulous practices he went through that would probably be very hard to define if we're thinking about the trope of gay conversion therapy or programs such as those in Boy Erased, the movie. But what he went through was just as harmful because of the messages he had internalised over many years. B could have been supported if he had understood earlier that he himself was actually a survivor of conversion practices and needed additional support, but it was a little bit too late for him. But it's not too late for many other people like B. Thanks.
Thank you. It's so true, isn't it, that actually we use this term conversion therapy, which has been, to be honest, it's been taken by the media, and at least there is awareness, but it is these lifelong messaging that I went through, Nathan, some of you went through, that causes such harm. When I started getting involved with this work myself, I didn't realise I was a survivor of 20 years of conversion practices because it didn't even occur to me that I'd been through so much prayer. But therapeutic practices do, sadly, they're not therapeutic, but do exist, and we've heard some of that from China, from you, Nancy and Mariann. I just want to ask a couple of questions. Even though you're working in environments where the state wouldn't even consider banning this, you're working with different groups. Yancy, you with the legal profession, Manny, I think you with the therapeutic profession. And I'm just wondering, perhaps I could ask you, Manny, first. What steps, if any, are being taken in Hungary amongst the therapeutic profession to recognise the harm? Is there any good news?
Well, it's a hard question. There is still a dispute about whether conversion therapy is good or not, like in the psychologist community. Like, not every psychologist agree with that conversion therapy is abuse and it doesn't work. And it is still a question for some of the professionals, which is very sad. I'm a member of the Hungarian Psychological Association's LGBT division, and we organize trainings and affirmative trainings for other psychologists to understand and to know how to be LGBT friendly to the clients. And this way we hope that we can reach every layer of the psychologist community to understand that it needs to be banned and it shouldn't be used at all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So working with some colleagues to try and get those educational materials out. Yancy, I know you've been focused really on trying to use the law. Is there any advice or work that's still going on there?
But we also organize training to the psychiatry and psychological association because they never speak out loud on this issue. So we push them to make their statement on this. But most of our community members, they experience conversion therapy is because they are taken by their parents. So the family issues in China are very crucial as well. So we also work with the family to try to relate the conversion practice into transform how their understanding about LGBT people. So we combine with other campaigns, tell stories to help the parents and general public understand better on what's meaning of being an LGBT person.
Great. So educational material. I mean, I know you both face quite physical brutality by the state and being taken and questioned for 24 hours. We salute your courage and your bravery. Andre, you just trying to look at the different dimensions. I know you've touched on the cultural challenges. I don't know if there's work been going there to help end as well as ban it. I don't know if there's more you want to say.
Absolutely. So I just want to make a note really about the role of the church and religion in a Pacific context. Here in this part of the world, we know with the Israel-Folau-saga as well as the Manly-Sea Jersey saga as well. And sometimes it's very easy for those of us who are outside of those communities to point our fingers and just say that's all wrong and archaic. But if you need to understand the role of the church and religion in a Pacific context, take my example for instance. I grew up, Pacific people in New Zealand are amongst the poorest people, least paid people in the country. Every single social indicator there is, we are performing at the bottom of that, alongside Tangata Whenua, Indigenous people of New Zealand, who, by the way, have adjunct to that because they've experienced it for centuries on end, legislated even as well. So for us, the role of the church is really important. My dad was a taxi driver, discriminated against his entire life, but the place where he does find acceptance is actually at the church on a Saturday when he goes up and he gets to flex his intellect, when he gets to speak. The church was there when other government, community places weren't there for us in a racist, neoliberalist, capitalist society. The church is really important. However, how can we shift and challenge the church? So one thing I would say is we need to be cognizant of that. We can't just dismiss the church as unimportant and not interesting and just lacking in human rights. It really is a place where we find one of our protective factors because of our social status in society. So when I think about the rainbow person, though, I think about this environment in which they're in, and I think about the protective factors for them. Their culture, their family, and their faith are indeed protective factors when they can't move through society the same way that the general population does. But you look at those then three issues, and you look at someone wanting to affirm and assert their sexuality or their gender identity, and guess what? It's going to be those same protective factors that are going to turn around and potentially be risk factors for them, because they will say that I don't want to bring shame to my family, shame to my culture, and my religion is telling me that I can't be who I am. And so you really need nuanced responses, and that's what we're trying to do at the Human Rights Commission. How can we get into that, not in this invasive top-down way, but how do we speak the language of the people, and sometimes not even use human rights, but rather in a way that we have human rights values and outcomes, but to engender the change that we need. It's going to be long, but it is going to be possible, and I'm very, very hopeful. And next week in Christchurch, we'll be doing a day session with pastors and religious leaders down in Christchurch. So really excited about what we're going to do there.
That's fantastic.
Thanks for the work that you've done.
I'm going to ask Nathan a similar question, but I think just to flag, in the UK, one of the things we've been doing is trying to get religious bodies to condemn conversion practices themselves. And we've had statements from the Church of England and the Methodist Church and the Quakers and the Buddhists and the Hindu. But it's, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's still a huge amount of denial. But ending, as you've both stressed, is really key, not just banning. And Nathan, I don't know if there's stuff that you feel we should be bearing in mind, doing, focusing on to really end these harmful practices.
So I think, as I was saying before, the ideology, the concepts, this sort of toxic soup of ideas that drives so much of the conversion movement, as we call it. Many people who are proponents of these ideas rarely have had a chance in a rational forum to actually articulate these things. So folks that I have connected with at the Victorian Human Rights Commission that implements the scheme in Victoria have gone into communities, and it's been the first time some leaders of various religious and cultural groups have actually been able to hear these things outside their head. Also, many religious community leaders don't actually know the harm that these ideas have caused to people because they've often left and gone off somewhere else. So it's letting people know, do you realise that when you dropped this ball from upstairs, it went down and hit this person on the head and knocked them out down the bottom? There is some basic concepts of non-violent communication there about helping people, even actually helping people articulate these things for themselves. There are many religious leaders that I've been worked with and sat with where I've actually tried to help them articulate the horrific things they think about me, and then to help them realise, actually, that doesn't sound quite so good. The other thing is that most survivors of conversion practices who were part of the research project at La Trobe Uni, led by Tim Jones, who's over there somewhere in the dark, found that survivors actually really need support to engage with their spirituality and want to maintain a connection with faith, and that seeing this as part of the culture war between God versus the gays is the least helpful framing for this.
It's really hard. Yeah. I'm so sorry, guys, we're running out of time, or rather the lights are flashing out and we've run out of time. I know these practices impact the transgender community and siblings, as well as those of us who are lesbian, gay, bisexual. I think I'm often asked, isn't there a big difference? And the truth is, it's the mindset of the person practicing it who has a predetermined purpose, if you like, that you have to be cisgendered, you have to be straight. It's their mindset, not the fact that the person might be struggling or questioning what I call the survivor. And that's the key determinant. Please give a warm thank you to all of these people. Thank you. You can hear the courage it takes. Can I ask, I've been asked to remind you that the ending ceremony today at 4:30 to 5 is really key, and we really would ask that you be there to witness the First Nation ceremony of passing on that baton. Do take some self-care. If this has triggered stuff for you, please come and talk to some of us or some of the pastoral team. And please now do, if you need to, move to your next session. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you. We are